Great. Good to see everyone this morning. Good to see those smiling faces out there. We're glad you're here this morning. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of Beatitudes. And this morning, after having 2 weeks on Blessed are the Poor in Spirit and a couple of weeks on Blessed are those that mourn, today we're going to have one class on Blessed are the Meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And you know, this morning as I was getting ready for church, something happened for the first time in, I guess, almost 44 years that Beth and I have been married. You know, when you teach these classes, you're thinking about all week long, the lesson that's ahead of you. And I've been thinking about blessed are the meek, all week long as getting ready for this class. And this morning it just so happened that as Beth was getting ready and I was getting ready, we were getting dressed. Beth was putting on her dress and I was doing this, and she decked me. She hit me right upside the head. First time that's happened. And I thought, wow. Of course, it was accidental, but I thought, wow, this is... And I want you to know, but because of this class, I was meek. And I did not retaliate. So I'm proof that this class works. Hopefully it'll work, and I hope it doesn't happen to you. But anyway, that was kind of an interesting thing that happened just this morning, and I just wanted to share that with you this morning. No extra charge. Now we see that we're in April the 24th, Blessed are the Meek, and we've got... I guess 5 more classes after this, so we're going to move on. So blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. As Jesus was on the mountainside delivering the Sermon on the Mount, the crowd is listening with amazement. We read in Matthew 7:28, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowd were amazed at his teaching. And I think what the crowd is hearing is much different from what the typical hypocritical talk that they were used to hearing from religious leaders. And instead they were hearing, as one writer described it, human compassion combined with heaven's love. So it had to have been refreshing for them to hear this kind of message. So this morning we're simply going to consider 3 questions in our study. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The first question is, who are the meek? And what does it mean to be meek? Secondly, how shall they inherit the earth? And then thirdly, what are some practical applications for us this morning? So our aim and our goal of our class this morning is that all of us will understand a little bit more about meekness and the blessedness that comes from being meek. So as each one of these Beatitudes, they described who we are to be based on what Jesus has to say. So this morning, let's look at who we are to be when it comes to the characteristic of meekness. We mentioned in one of our earlier classes that the Beatitudes are steps. The first step is, blessed are the poor in spirit. Understanding our helpless condition, our spiritual bankruptcy, looking at ourselves with an humble and honest attitude that we realize our need, seeing Jesus as our only hope. The second step is, blessed are those who mourn. And this deals with our attitude toward our helplessness in sin, our weeping over our lost condition and the lost condition of others, which leads to repentance. Which brings us to today's third step, blessed are the meek. And it deals with our attitude toward God and others. Am I submissive to Him and His will? And do I respond humbly to Him with a heart that says, Thy will be done? And am I willing to submit to others? But in today's world, this third beatitude very well may just be the most misunderstood beatitude of them all. You know, we live in a cutthroat, dog eat dog, toot your own horn, let's get ahead, wave your own flag, promote your own goals kind of world where only the strong survive. You know, it would seem to be that meekness might be the quickest way to get run over or to get ripped off. You know, meekness is a real challenge in the world in which we live. In the worldview, meekness, others think, is the first step toward failure. I was thinking of a couple of examples. Have you ever heard a football coach, when he's giving a speech to his players, he said, now, if we're going to win this game, we need to be meek. Get out there and be meek. Now, you would never hear that at a halftime talk, right? Especially when the team is down and trying to rally. But in reality, the football coach would be right. You know, meekness does not mean weakness, but it has as its root the idea of strength through discipline. That would be a pretty amazing team. You know, a strength through discipline, that should be every coach's dream, right? You know, I was thinking of another example that just happened this week. Anyone use GPS when you're trying to find your way? We're lost without GPS, right? And it's also nice when you're driving your car, you don't have to look. You know, it talks to you. You know, she talks to you, right? Well, just a couple of days ago, I was driving, and I pretty well much knew where I was going. But yet, she was talking to me, turn here and turn there. Well, I was the one in power because I was driving the car. And she was telling me to go a different way than I was planning on going. Yet I exercised my weakness. I listened to what she told me to do, and we ended up safely in the right place. So I decided to be meek and to follow series instructions on where to go on the GPS. So what is meekness? Well, in the Greek, the word means gentle, mild, or kind, and referred to as an outward observed attitude. It indicates humility or kindness, possessing composure even under challenging and difficult circumstances. Webster describes, go back one here. Webster defines meek as being mild of temper, soft, gentle, not easily provoked or irritated, yielding. And then Albert Barnes, in his commentary, he describes meekness as patience in the reception of injuries, not cowardice, but it is the opposite of sudden anger, of malice or vengeance. Charles Wesley said it this way: they that hold all their passions and affections evenly balanced, then slow to anger, composed, humble, gentle, kind. Humble, gentle, kind, composed, patient, evenly balanced, slow to anger. So you kind of get the idea of what it means to be meek. So the question this morning is, do these descriptions describe you? I've asked myself the same question as I looked at these definitions and looking closer at this beatitude. Is there anyone here this morning that would consider themselves a perfect 10 when it comes to meekness? If we have any perfect 10s, I'll be happy to give you the mic and you can teach the rest of the class this morning. No one's a perfect 10? Well, I'm not a perfect 10 either. I know you'd be surprised to hear that, but I'm not a perfect 10 either. But since I'm up here, I guess I'll go ahead and finish the class. And they'll carry on. Barnes mentioned that meekness is the opposite of anger, malice, vengeance. So let's talk about anger for a minute. Anyone ever struggle with anger? I know I have. In my younger years, I struggled a lot with anger, and I'll have to say that the game of golf helped me to learn how to control my anger and my temper. And my dad had a lot of help in helping me to manage my anger. Well, let me encourage you to carefully consider what we're going to talk about next, because it very well may help you to channel your anger. God has given us the ability to become angry. There's nowhere in the Bible that says that God honors someone who is unable or unwilling to use the right kind of anger. You know, as Christians, there are things that can and should cause us to be angry, but it needs to be the right kind of anger. You know, there are very upsetting and disgusting things like child and drug trafficking and abortion, pornography, homosexuality, foul language, government fraud. You know, these things, among many other things, should make us all angry, because it's rebellion against and disrespect toward God. In spite of this woke world in which we find ourselves living today, we must be angry and willing to speak out against sin. When our anger is controlled by God, we can be instruments to help bring about change in this world. Very badly needed change that we need in this world today. If we ever stop being angry about the sin that is around us, what would that say about our convictions? Ephesians 4:26 says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." A couple of examples of a sinless form of anger in the Bible is when Moses came down from Mount Sinai and he sees all the people reveling in sin. Another, when Jesus went into the temple and cleansed his Father's house. There is a godless anger that destroys and a godly anger that builds up. Let's look at a couple of verses about that. First, a godly anger. Proverbs 16:32, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." Later in Proverbs 25:28, "Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls." Now that is power out of control, a godless anger. Someone said, "Temper is such a wonderful thing that it's a shame to lose it." The person who loses his temper loses control of himself. A successful businessman once said, "The best administrator is the governor of his own temper." The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote, "Anyone can become angry. That's easy." Now, this is the part I want you to pay close attention to. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, it's not very easy, is it? Pretty challenging to have anger that is controlled like that. So what we're talking about here is power under control. Anger is power, just as fire is power. You've heard it said, his anger flared up. When fire is under control, It is our servant and accomplishes great things for us. But when fire is out of control, it becomes our master. And the result, it's devastating, it's destruction. So it is with anger. Reminds me of a story. A lady once said to her preacher, she said, "There's nothing wrong with losing my temper. I just blow up, and then it's over with." And the preacher replied, "So does a shotgun. But look at the damage that is left behind." That's destructive anger, out of control. Let's think for a few more minutes about this idea of power under control. The Greek word that is translated meekness, it was a pretty familiar word to the people in Jesus' day, and it was used to describe a soothing medicine. A patient who is wrestling with a fever is given medication by a doctor to help give him relief so he can sleep. The word also was used by sailors to describe a gentle breeze. You ever been out working in your yard on a hot summer day, and then all of a sudden you feel that cool, gentle breeze that just seems to refresh you? You know, I long for days like that on the golf course, and it sure feels good when that cool breeze comes in. I think you know the feeling. It's refreshing. But doctors and sailors were not the only ones to use that word. Farmers used it too. And it was used to describe a broken horse. A horse that has been broken. You know, every horse has to be broken, or it cannot fulfill its function on the farm, or even as a show horse. Somebody has to break the horse at some time or other so that its power can be channeled into constructive work. Now, my wife Beth tells me that her grandfather, who lived in Middle Tennessee, owned some Tennessee walking horses. Beautiful animals. I suppose Nathan Ingram, growing up in Middle Tennessee himself, could tell us something about Tennessee walking horses. Beautiful, refined, elegant. And those strong horses that have all the qualities of a thoroughbred racehorse, you know, they go through extensive training to be able to high step and change gaits, you know, at the simple command of the rider. That is meekness, strength under control. On the other hand, think of yourselves out in the Wild West, and you spot a wild stallion out there roaming around, running free on the range. You know, this animal is obviously powerful and full of energy. However, it's useless as long as it remains to go wild. So this wild animal doesn't know what it's like to even carry a man or pull a load or put on a show. But let's suppose that you pursue this wild animal. You get it into the corral. Now in the corral, it's calmed down enough where it can be bridled and saddled. Now it's time to bring the expert in. You know, when this wild animal comes into the corral, calm down enough, and before you know it, the horse begins to run and to buck. And then after a while, the rider is now in control. It has been tamed, brought under control, made useful for some good purpose. This illustrates somewhat of what it's like for a human to learn to be meek. Maybe you're thinking of someone like this. Maybe it used to describe the person you used to be. Maybe you're thinking of someone who was kind of like a wild animal, that needs to be tamed. Meekness is simply a will that has been tamed and brought under control. Just as a wild horse is tamed and brought under its owner's control, so we as human beings, we have to be tamed and brought under control, brought under divine control. Therefore, it follows that a meek man is not a weak man. He's still a strong man, but has now submitted himself to the controlling influence of God in his life. Meekness is the taming of a wild animal within each of us and putting that power to work in God's kingdom. Jesus called himself meek and lowly. Matthew 11:29. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. He was certainly not like the waves of the sea that are tossed to and fro. He was a man of strong determination, strong words, strong actions. He could be moved to great anger by false deeds, false men, and false religion. In Mark 11, Jesus drove out the men of the temple and overturned the tables of the merchants. He was meek, yet full of energy and passion, which surpasses that of ordinary people. So what then is meekness? Meekness is submission to divine control. When we are tempted, and think of temptations that face us, those who are meek and are tamed are under the control of God. We are able to withstand those temptations. So let's go back to those three illustrations: medicine, wind, and a horse. What do all three of those have in common? Power. But they must keep their power under control, or they will do an amazing amount of damage. You know, medicine has the power to relieve pain, calm nerves, kill germs, strengthen organs, promote healing, but an overdose of medicine can kill. A summer breeze certainly can be refreshing, but a hurricane destroys and can cause billions of dollars in damages. Now that is power out of control. You ever been to a rodeo and seen that bucking bronco, wild animal? A broken horse can give both work and pleasure to his master, but a horse out of control is danger. All of these have power, and their power needs to be under control to be useful. So let's consider and look at some examples in the Bible of meekness when we think of power under control. First of all, we have the example of Abraham. When he left Ur of the Chaldees, he took Lot, his nephew, with him, and it wasn't long, as happens in the best of families, that there was some family conflict. Genesis 13, verse 7, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. If you were Abraham, what would you have done? I mean, you could have told him to pack up and move on. He could have read him the right act, right? After all, Abraham was God's chosen servant, and he was even called the friend of God. God had called Abraham, Lot was just tagging along. Then in verse 8, and Abram said unto Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou take the right hand, then I will go to the left. Abraham had power over Lot, but his power was under control. And he gave Lot first choice, and he exercised his meekness. When I read in there, brethren be brethren, or we be brethren, I'm reminded of a story that my mother told me as she was growing up in the church up in Lubbock, Texas, and the church was growing leaps and bounds, and there was discussion about building a bigger place to worship. It turns out to be that there were some of the brethren that really wanted the bench seats in the new auditorium, the pews. They wanted the bench seats. And then there were strong opinions from other brothers that wanted the theater kind of seats, the kind that you sit in movie theaters. And so there was contention. But as it turned out, one wise elder stood up and said, brethren, let's be brethren. Cooler heads prevailed, and they solved the problem. My understanding as a result, half of the auditorium had bench seats, and the other half had the theater-style seats. That was their way of solving the problem and still being unified. So that's an interesting story. Romans 12 in verse 10, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. Sometimes we really don't want to hear that, do we? Philippians 2 in verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Because Abraham knew who he was and to whom he belonged, he was not afraid to submit to Lot. He had already submitted to God. He knew his own inheritance was secure in the Lord, and his letting Lot take first choice would not rob him of anything that God had in store for him. Abraham had power, but his power was under control. So God kept his promise and allowed Abraham to inherit the earth. Another example, Joseph. Another good illustration of meekness. Of course, we know that Joseph was mistreated by his brothers, sold into Egypt as a slave. He was lied about by his master's wife and unjustly put into prison. Then one day he is elevated to become the prime minister of Egypt. He was in a position to get revenge when his brothers showed up for food and bowed down before him. He refused to retaliate, but instead, Joseph treated them in such a way that they confessed their sins and repented. Joseph had power over them, but he kept his power under control. Listen to this statement. Meekness doesn't show itself when we are wrong, but when we are right. Meekness is not when I get caught doing something wrong. It is when I am right and have the power to hurt somebody who is wrong, as Joseph could have done. Another example is Moses. Moses was called the meekest man on earth. Numbers 12:3. Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men that were upon the face of the earth. And look what Moses had to endure. How quickly the Israelites began to complain after coming out of Egypt. And for the next 40 years, they complained. They complained about the way God led them and the way he fed them. And when Moses finally brought them to the border of the promised land, they refused to go in. But all the while, Moses was cultivating meekness. Moses always had the power, but it was power under control. Now let's talk about a New Testament example. Saul of the New Testament. When Paul was Saul, he possessed great power. He used that power to persecute and to even kill. Acts 26, verse 14. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Saul was like a wild animal that had never been broken. But God broke him, and a spirit of meekness came into his life. He used his power under control for the good of others and the glory of God. So what about us? You and I must make the choice. Will we submit to the difficulties in life and cultivate meekness? Or will we rebel and produce hardness? The fruit of the Spirit is meekness, but it takes time for the fruit to grow. And the fruit grows best in the storms of life. Back to the Old Testament example of David. David's greatest victories were with his heart, not his hands. In 1 Samuel chapter 24, you know the story well. Saul was in the cave where David and his men were hiding, and he went to sleep. David had the advantage and could have easily used his sword to kill Saul and take the throne. In fact, some of David's men encouraged him to do just that, to put an end to the man who was chasing them and who wanted to take their lives. But instead of taking off Saul's head, he quietly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And even doing that made David feel guilty. David had the power to kill Saul on more than one occasion, but he kept his power under control. Now you might be thinking, well, when are you going to get back to the best example of meekness? And now's that time, obviously, Jesus. Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Also in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. It took more power for Jesus to submit than for Peter to draw out his sword and fight. Peter's reaction, it was natural. What Jesus did was unnatural. Jesus exercised power under control. He could have called 10,000 angels. But instead, Philippians 2, verse 8, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Looking at these examples and thinking of power under control, surely there's no one here this morning who can seriously think that meekness is a form of weakness. It is spiritual strength of the highest magnitude. It is the willingness to be controlled by God in a world which at best is indifferent toward God, and at its worst, openly blasphemous and rebellious toward God. Let's take a moment and look at 4 things that are associated with meekness. First of all, being teachable. Psalm 25 and verse 9. And the meek he will guide in justice, and the meek he will teach his way. The meek man is the one who allows himself to be taught. He allows the Lord to lead his life. James chapter 1, verse 21. Wherefore, putting away all filthiness and overflowing of wickedness, receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Another thing that's associated with meekness is being humble or lowly, as we mentioned earlier in Matthew 11:25. The meek man is the one who emptied himself of himself and filled himself with God. Selfishness and arrogance are not associated with the one who sees himself as a servant. Another thing associated with meekness is being gentle. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1, Paul urges us with the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Now I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent am of good courage toward you. So meekness and gentleness walking hand in hand. And then lastly, meekness is associated with being patient. Psalm 37 and verse 9, for evildoers shall be cut off, but those that wait for Jehovah, they shall inherit the land. So question, who will inherit the land? The answer, those who are patient, those who wait on the Lord. And who are they? The answer is the meek will inherit the land. Psalm 37, verse 11, but the meek shall inherit the land and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. So meekness and patience go hand in hand. So what about some characteristics of those who are meek? Well, first of all, they will be saved from the judgment. Psalm 76, verse 9, when God arose to judgment to save all the meek of the earth, they will be exalted by God. We read in Psalm 147, verse 6, Jehovah upholdeth the meek. He bringeth the wicked down to the ground. Also, God will guide and teach them. Psalm 25 and verse 9, the meek he will guide into justice, and the meek he will teach his way. Also, God beautifies them with salvation. Psalm 149, verse 4, for Jehovah taketh pleasure in his people, but he will beautify the meek with salvation. Also, they rejoice in God. Isaiah 29, verse 19, the meek shall also increase their joy in Jehovah, and the poor among men shall rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. They are kind, and they turn the other cheek. Luke 6:29. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. So in the time we have remaining, let's look at what it means, for they shall inherit the earth. When you think of the word inherit, what do you usually think of? Think when someone died and they're going to leave you an inheritance. Well, in this case, it is we who die. We die to ourselves so that we can grow in meekness. And as we grow in meekness, we share in the rich inheritance through Jesus Christ, who died for us. Inherit what? Inherit the earth. Well, what does that mean, to inherit the earth? Does that mean that we're going to be blessed with material things? Apparently not. Jesus was meek, and yet he possessed, very little worldly goods. Well, does it mean that that the meek will not be plagued with the difficulties of life? No. Moses, Jesus, others that we mentioned earlier, they were meek, and yet they faced one difficulty after another. So in order to answer the question, we need to go back to the place where the original statement is found in Psalm 37 in verse 9, which Jesus' words were either quoted from or alluded to. It reads, "For evildoers shall be cut off, but those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth." And you can see, going down, you see other verses in here that talk about the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight in the abundance of peace. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over in Mark chapter 10. "For Jesus answered and said, Assuredly I say to you, there was no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or father or mother or a wife or children or lands for my sake in the Gospels, who shall not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." Paul said that all things belong to Christians. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 21. "Let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things present or things to come, all are yours. And you are Christ, and Christ is God." Anything that is worthwhile in this world are possessions of the meek. Now, the meek may not own a single inch of land or one stock certificate, but they recognize that all belongs to God, and all its beauty is ours to enjoy, among which is love and friendship. They have mastered anger and passion. Proverbs 16, verse 32, "He who is slow to anger is better than the Almighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." So to be able to control yourself is to have the power that makes life truly great. Some other practical applications. Meekness is required in our relationship to God. Zephaniah 2, verse 3. "Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness and seek humility, that it may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger." Meekness is necessary to receive God's word. James 1:21. "Therefore lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." The Christian walk requires meekness. Ephesians 4, verse 1 and 2. "I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, bearing one another." Meekness is also required in teaching others the gospel and restoring brethren, as you can see these verses in Galatians chapter 6, in verse 1. "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted." And finally, meekness is required in our relationship with others. In closing, I'd like to close out our lesson with the way William Barclay summarized this beatitude. Oh, the bliss of the man who is always angry at the right time and never angry at the wrong time, who has every instinct and impulse and passion under control because he himself is controlled by God, who has the humility to realize his own ignorance and his own weakness, for such a man is a king among men. That's from William Barclay. So what about us? Are we meek? Do we have some room to improve? And as the football coach didn't say, let's go out there and be meek. Thank you for your attention.